I would like to apologize first.
반갑습니다.
Anyways, it's great to see you all.
세미나를 주관하는
I'm from the Institute for East Asia Peace Studies. My name is Jeon Byung-ok. I'm president of IEAPS.
우리나라가 남북으로 분단된 지
Korea was divided 70 years ago, more than 70 years ago. And because of that, the country has remained divided for such a long time, and this is accepted as the norm to many Koreans. It's a shame that this is being accepted and perceived as a norm. The two Germanys achieved reunification in 45 years and emerged as one of the wealthiest countries in Europe. We should learn from the lessons of unified Germany to realize the long-aspired goal of reunification in Korea. The Ministry of Reunification has organized KGFP 2021, and under this forum, our institute will provide prospects on the reunification of the Korean Peninsula. Today's seminar will be moderated by Professor Bang Young-jun of Seongsin Women's University. And allow me to thank the presenters and discussants. We have invited prominent scholars here in Korea who will provide us with great insight. Thank you very much. Good morning, my name is Bang Young-jun and I will be moderating this session 8-1. We will hear two presentations which will be followed by 3 discussions. We do not have much time for the session, so my job would be to speak less and give more time to the presenters and discussants. First, allow me to introduce the presenters and discussants. We have with us Professor Hosaka Yuji. I'm sure that you know Professor Hosaka Yuji, who has starred in many TV programs. He graduated from Tokyo University and also did his PhD in Korea University, and he actually became a Korean citizen. He conducts many studies about Korea and about policies of the inter-Korean relations. He has written many books. His major books include New Chinilpa, Japan Overturning Dokdo, 1500 Years of History. Next, we have with us Professor Lee Sang-myeon. He graduated from Seoul Law School, and after graduating from SNU, he passed the Foreign Affairs examination and served in the Foreign Ministry. He studied at Harvard Law School and received a doctorate, worked at Harvard Donga Law School. And he also taught at SNU for about 30 years and recently retired. And next, I would like to present Mr. Lee Jae-hyung, who is president of IEAPS. So he graduated from Korea Military Academy, and he also got an MS degree from SNU, completed or as a course of U.S. Army Logistics Management in Lee, Virginia. He wrote books about China's maritime strategy and maritime rivalry between China and the US. Next, we have with us President Kang Seok-seung of the Institute for 21st Century Security Strategies, Korea. He served at this institute for a very long time, so he is well-versed in not only the literature, but the theories, but also the practice. And he has been an activist of reunification across many fields, including broadcasting. Next, we have with us lawyer Choi Gi-sik, who graduated from Korea University's law school. And it is my understanding that he is an expert in judicial research. He served as a military attorney before being commissioned as a prosecutor. And he has been studying and closely looking at laws regarding reunification. The presenters will have 15 minutes according to the guideline provided by the Ministry of Unification. I know it's not a lot, but please limit your presentation to 15 minutes, and each discussant will have 5 minutes for their commentaries, which will be followed by a panel discussion session and Q&A session. It will be a tight schedule, so I ask for your cooperation, presenters and discussants. Without further ado, allow me to present Professor Hosaka Yuji for his presentation.
Hello everyone, as was introduced, I'm Hosaka Yuji from Sejong University. Because we do not have much time, I will begin my presentation, and thank you very much for preparing this session. And I would like to thank the director and the president of the Institute for East Asia Peace Studies. So today I'm going to be presenting under the title Korean Unification from the Perspective of German Reunification. Germany's reunification did not happen overnight. Already in 1985, the perestroika and other open-door policies initiated by the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, preceded this event. And there was also the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 10, 1989, and eventually this resulted in the reunification of Germany. So these are some pictures during those times. However, even before that, 20 years before that, such movements had emerged. For example, it was the Willy Brandt's diplomatic efforts to engage with the Eastern European bloc. So this became the trigger, which was improved relations between East and West Germany. It was improved in the early 1970s due to eastward diplomacy by West German Chancellor Willy Brandt to improve relations with the Eastern European countries. And Willy Brandt's diplomatic efforts drove East and West Germany toward mutual recognition of each other as states. And recognizing each other as states, there are various interpretations of this, but in the German documents, it says 2 German states. So it can be considered as countries, so 2 countries. And So in Korean, sometimes it is not interpreted as countries, but just as provinces and states. So this is the map of Germany right now. And in 1970, West Germany signed the Treaty of Moscow with the Soviet Union, promising mutual non-aggression. And West Germany was quite active in improving its relations with neighboring countries. For example, West Germany also signed the Warsaw Pact with Poland to normalize relations between the two countries. And also, in 1971, the United States, Soviet Union, Britain, and France reached the quadripartite agreement on Berlin to facilitate transit between East and West Berlin. So, such agreements could be brought about by the favorable conditions of neighboring countries, and this demonstrates this. West Germany signed the transit agreement with East Germany in 1972 to guarantee transit between West Berlin and West Germany. Berlin was in East Germany, and there was quite a distance between West Berlin and West Germany. And so there would be guaranteeing of transit between West Berlin and West Germany. And this was agreed with East Germany. And this was also based on the diplomatic achievements of West German Chancellor Willy Brandt. And then there was the signing of the East Germany, West Germany Basic Treaty. It shows that the two Germanys will work on normalizing their relations. So this was the basis and foundation for the unification of Germany. Then what are some lessons that we can draw from the reunification of East and West Germany? The North and South needs to first strive to achieve diplomatic safety with neighboring countries. In that respect, South Korea cannot neglect any one of the relations between Korea, China, Korea, Japan, Korea, US, and Korea, Russia. It has to have favorable relations with all of these neighboring countries. So you cannot just think about relations with the United States. It might undermine the situation if you only rely on the United States, and it should move toward mutual recognition between the two Koreas based on good relations with neighboring countries. So you need to establish good relations with neighboring countries, and then there has to be mutual recognition between the two Koreas. Of course, in 1991, in words, out of formality, the basic agreement recognized the two states, but it was not realized and implemented in reality. So we need to realize actual recognition. And we need to mark an end to mutual hostility and hostile policies between the two Koreas. And it is something that the government and its people should also recognize. And many South Koreans, you would have to say, do not recognize North Korea as a complete state. And in unifying East and West Germany, it was important that they had mutually recognized each other as a state about 20 years prior to the unification. So there was exchanges between the two German states before they had reunification, and it took 20 years. So this is something that needs to be considered. Then let's look at the four neighboring powers and the Korean Peninsula. The neighboring four countries, powers, are in favor of a divided South and North. If the two Koreas become unified, then, and if this is led by the United States, country that is led, a unification that is led by the United States, then Russia and Korea, rather Russia and China will think that the unified Korea and a liberalized and democratized North Korea will be a threat to them. And if the two Koreas are unified around a socialist ideology, the United States and Japan will regard the unified South and North as a threat to them, because it would take China's side. And the fact that North Korea already possesses nuclear weapons also poses an aspect that is completely different from the situation of East and West Germany, because these nuclear weapons poses a threat to its four neighboring powers. Against this backdrop, the two Koreas have no choice but to overcome this situation through some other way. So the North and South has to move toward gradual unification. So this is something that has to be pursued. Of course, there could be a rapid and radical unification. However, this will be because of a sudden change in DPRK, and Japan, China, and even in South Korea. This is something that we do not want, because this will lead to massive refugees, and this is a big situation. Therefore, we need to block this. We would have to block this, and that is the position of China and South Korea, because there will be an overflow of refugees. Therefore, we need to move toward peaceful coexistence first and then move toward unification. So, since 2018, Washington, Pyongyang, and Seoul carried out discussions and negotiations for the end of war treaty, but it became a failure since the 2019 Hanoi negotiation, and we hear that Japan will try to undermine this. So Japan's sabotage operations seem to have happened, and Japan's position at the time was the same as that of the U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton. One of the big challenges for South Korea is now to prevent Japan's sabotage operation. South Korea neglected and ignored Japan's views and Japan. So if you neglect and disregard them, then they might try to sabotage. Therefore, you need to embrace them and try to work with them, and this can be a way to persuade the United States too. And the Japanese regime is a very far right, and if there is a regime change to a more progressive administration, then the road to peaceful coexistence between the two Koreas will become more easier. And there is the general election this year in October. So we have to watch and see what will happen then. And so I will try to end my presentation due to time constraint. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for being punctual. I said 15 minutes because I thought that maybe you could talk for about 20 minutes, but you finished your presentation in 13 minutes, so thank you very much for that. You gave us your presentation from the perspective of Japan as a former Japanese. So thank you very much for the presentation. Now, Professor Lee, you can use up to 20 minutes. Do you hear me? Good morning. This is the title of my presentation, Prospects for Korean Reunification as Reflected upon the German Case. So I would like to look at Germany's case to pave the way forward for Korea. Should we learn everything from Germany, or should we selectively adopt what they did. Let us look at the outlook for the reunification. It's gloomy, which tells us that we need to self-examine what's going wrong and search for a new path. Now, to be honest, the two Koreas lack sincere aspiration for unification, and they are poorly prepared. And the two Koreas tend to use reunification politically, which is not welcome. Now, how are the two conditions different in South and North Korea, and what have they been doing so far? Of course, we will look at both, but there are many people that say that having a confederation would be the way forward. However, that is not true because it is only temporary and it has no successful precedent. Then why is it so? Also, we have the president and people talking about the end of the war and declaring the end of the war, but if the armistice system is ignored, what's the use of declaring the end of the war? And I hear people saying that North and South Koreans are impatient. So they should be more patient, like Germany. Then let's compare Germany and Korea. This is back in the 18th century. And I believe that October 3rd, 1991 was similar to this photo. Now, we have to search for unification in the dark. Before 1871, the two Germanys fought fiercely. However, after reunification since 1871, there was no more civil wars. They invaded other countries. So the history tells us that the situation is different. And when it comes to Germany, what happened is that the people of East Germany pulled down the Berlin Wall. No one told them to do so, and there were many refugees who moved to West Germany. So one day, the Berlin Wall collapsed, and the majority party collapsed as a result. So Chancellor Kohl did not have reunification on top of his agenda, and the two Germanys did not talk about reunification that much. They talked about basic treatment for integration, but the terminology reunification was not so much used. But once the majority party collapsed, the two Germanys saw a glimpse of hope for reunification. So in 1990, Chancellor Kohl visited Gorbachev and discussed on possible reunification in Germany. And at the time, unless the NATO does not threaten the Soviet Union, Gorbachev seems to have accepted Germany's plan for reunification. So in 1990, Germany experienced a major transition point. they signed a treaty for the absorption of East and West Germany, and East Germany was acceded to West Germany. But what about Korea? The two Koreas fought. They went through war. And I am an expert in international law, and we are still at war. So internationally speaking, the situation is different from that of Germany. And well, if we travel back to the time of provisional government, at the time there was this communist movement, and the Lenin funds divided the Shanghai section and the Irkutsk section. And at the time there was this conflict and war between these two sections. And as you know, in 1920 there was the Battle of Cheongsanmi. And following that year, the Irkutsk section and the Soviet Union section had a war. And I'm sure that you've heard of this freedom catastrophe. So now there was two different sections confronting each other. So there was the provisional government in Korea, and the creative faction was isolated. Of course, Kim-gu did his best to maintain the creative faction, but Lee Seung-man was impeached. Now, let's look at after the liberation of Korea. We have to look at the history of Korea. So after the fight between the two Koreas and before the establishment of the South and North Korean governments, there were, for instance, the April 3rd Jeju uprising. There was the Jeju Island Communist Party that tried to seize power, and there was about 800 small and large battles at the 38th parallel. Now there was this armistice agreement, but as you know, this is not a full-fledged agreement. The two Koreas stopped shooting at each other, but this was a half-completed agreement. And since the signing of the armistice agreement, all the different parties got together to discuss the future of the Korean Peninsula. North Korea, PRC, Soviet Union, that participated for North Korea, and South Korea and the US, as well as the 16 UN member states that fought for South Korea, got together to discuss the future of Korea. However, they did not yield much tangible results. And then this led to the political conference in 1954 in Geneva. And then the two leaders from the two Koreas got together to talk about a bilateral cooperation. However, they failed to abide by such agreement. So what South Korea has been suggesting so far is a single community between the two Koreas. So this started with Chun Do-han and was succeeded by Roh Tae-woo and Kim Young-sam. as well as Kim Dae-jung. So since reunification is not a viable option for now, let us seek a single, one community and maintain the armed forces as is. However, that wasn't. It's easier said than done. So before the Inter-Korean Summit, the two talked about a loose form of federation. Of course, back in 1980s, there was this idea of Koryo Federation. But anyways, in English, it's Confederation. Now, both South and North Korea sought confederation and a loose form of federation as well. But a loose form of federation entails more risk than confederation because it's about having one constitution, one national assembly, and if that's not viable, let's create one single organization that governs everything. However, what happened was this. So there was the sinking of the ROK ship Cheonan and Yeonpyeong-do bombardment. Now, on the first day of KGFP 2021, the minister Jung Se-hyun gave his keynote speech and said that we must seek confederation and maybe it will become a union like the EU. But in theory or practice, that's not viable. I'm sorry to say this, but it's not feasible. We can't have two governing authorities. They will fight in the end, and it will not be successful. So federation and confederation are different in many ways. So we have one law in one side and multiple laws in the other side, and we have each member countries serving as agents at one side and just one union on the other side. So if we look at the example of the EU, we have different types of confederation, and multilateral confederation is a loose form before federation, and there were some countries that experienced this. The US, Switzerland, Germany are some case of point. And because federation cannot happen overnight, they first start with a loose form of federation with multiple unions to eventually move on to federation. However, it can only be possible when there are multilateral parties involved. That was the case of Germany with 38 unions. That led to federation, and that pursued reunification. And it was after the fierce 1870 war. And Switzerland is also another case in point. Now, before the federation, so there are many cases that adopted a loose form of federation. And also people talk about Belgium, that it's a federation system because some people speak Dutch, some people speak French, some German, and they all live in one community. And some people say that that can be an option that we can explore, but I don't think so because they have their unique features. In the past, they had Dutch people from the Netherlands. The Netherlands was a major power, and they fought in war against Germany and France. And they seized dominance. And after the Napoleon War,
결국 화란 자체 내에서도 이제
the Netherlands
남북으로 분열이 나가지고 그 언어권에 따라서
experienced division, which led to multiple groups speaking different languages.
그 독일어 비슷한 화란어하고 게하고
So we have people who speak Dutch, those who speak French.
싸우다가
They fought for a long time, and in 1930,
화란 쪽을 내쫓고
under the support of France, they kicked out the Dutch people, and then that led to a discussion where the concerned parties got together to seek a solution for a union and to create a buffer zone so that these different ethnic groups do not fight with each other. So people like Yu Gil-jun pursued that, but Lee Seung-man was against such an idea. And if you look at Belgium, in 1830s, became a neutral state after armistice. But it was not Belgium's decision to become so. It was somewhat forced by its neighboring countries. So it still adopts a loose form of federation. And of course, the German community broke away from that community. However, they still have some people who speak German. And it's chaos there. So in Brussels, just like Paris and London, the number of public servants is the same across all three cities. So let's say you have two unions forming one confederation. How about that? Well, if we look at the history, there were some times when we had two kings, when we served two kings. But if we look at the case of Arab, it was not long-lived. And when the Yugoslavia was collapsed, Serbia had to adopt a confederation because they had no other choice. But then that also failed. The Serbia and Montenegro case also failed. Now, the socialist and the communist countries, they were sometimes united, but then it was short-lived as well. And since then, we can't really find successful cases here. So Senegal and Gambia, that also failed. And in Arab, well, as you know, they are still mired in civil war. So this concept of confederation is not something that we should pursue. South Korea has so far pursued confederation from Notewu up to today. But I am against such proposal. In theory, it doesn't work, and we have no successful precedent. Then what other options do we have? Let us look at the case of Yemen. The Yemeni unification collapsed, so it's a fiasco. Now, this can be an option, achieving unification with peace, but it's easier said than done. So back in Geneva Convention, the 20 countries that participated in the Korean War got together for a convention, and we have to repeat history. But as I said, we can't have two leaders discussing in a conference. And we can maybe have a 4-party discussion, but then I believe that 6-party talks would be better than that. And when there was the atomic bomb that destroyed Japan at the time, well, the countries got together to have discussions, and I also served at the Ministry of the State, and the 4-party talks and 6-party talks will all be challenging. And since 20 countries participated in the Korean War, we need them to sign off the agreement. But when Hwang Jang-yeop was still with us, I met him, and he told me that unless the US and North Korea agrees on some tangible outcomes, we cannot see any hope for the Korean Peninsula, and I agree with him. So this is back in 2017 when the mood was negative in Korea, with North Korea testing missiles and the US threatening North Korea. At the time, Tillerson talked about the 20 countries that participated in the Korean War getting together for the next conference, and I was quite surprised to see that. But this was not accepted by China. And actually, this led to the ministerial meeting of the foreign ministers. Anyways, now this is the first step, cooperation. Step 2 is disarmament. And as I said, I think that we need to expand the scope of the talk from 2-party to 4 parties or 6 parties. But we need to take a phased approach, and bilateral as well as 4-party and 6-party talks should take place. And I ask my students this question. Other than Korea, what country do you think aspires for reunification on the Korean Peninsula? And students often say no country, but then I force them to raise their hands, and some people say maybe Japan, maybe China, and Russia, about 7, because they have the refugee policy. And Japan did not participate in the Korean War, and it has very intertwined national interests when it comes to its ties with Korea. But anyways, so as Hosaka-san mentioned, we need to approve this process. And the parties that fought together in the war should get together, but it shouldn't be all talks and no action. We talk about the basic agreement or declaring end of war, but we have to first have a 4-party and 6-party talk and move on to Geneva Convention to have all the concerned parties, the 20 countries, to sign the agreement to stop the war. And then that will lead to more cooperation, exchanges, and so forth. So we first have to stop the battle and end the state of hostility. Now, to learn from Germany's case, we have to learn about the relationship between the two Germanys. And there should be
통일이라는 말 자체가
no
통일을 말하는
we should not use the terminology reunification because reunification involves the idea of absorption. So we have to accept the reality, and on top of that, we have to be honest with each other. And the two Koreas should have a frank conversation with its neighboring countries, and they have to deal with the topic of reunification in a sincere manner. Then we can see some glimpse of hope for reunification. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Professor Lee Sang-myeon. You gave us details about the history of Korea's division and what we can learn from Germany, and also the protracted division that has been in Korea for a long time. Now we will move on to the discussion session. Each discussant will have 5 minutes each. First, President Lee Jae-hyung.
네. 호사카 유지 교수 이상면 교수님.
Professor Lee and Professor Hosaka, thank you for the wonderful presentations. While listening to the presentations, I felt that both of you pinpointed the most important things. And based on your two presentations, I would like to make a couple of comments.
우선 호사카 유지 교수님 발표문에 대해서
First, on Professor Hosaka's presentation, you mentioned about the 2018 Hanoi, Washington, Pyongyang summit, and you said that one of the reasons behind the fallout of that summit was because of the U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton making comments, and that behind that was Japan's interference in trying to sabotage it, and I agree to that point. And going forward, you said that Japan's regime, if it changed from the far right to a progressive administration, that the road to peaceful coexistence will become much more easier. And I think that is a keen insight. However,
당시 트럼프 대통령은 왜 자기하고
during that time,
의견이 맞지 않았던 존 볼튼 보좌관을
I wonder why Trump did not dismiss the U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton when he was not aligned with Trump's agenda. And so I wonder why he took John Bolton with him during the Hanoi meeting. And if you have any thoughts about that, please share it with us. And during the North Korea-U.S. summit, Japan kept on talking about the Japanese abductees to pressure North Korea, which had nothing to do with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and lobbied to the United States. In the future, if there are North Korea and Washington summits or any four-party meetings, do you believe Japan's attitude and actions will be similar? And next, I would like to make some comments and to provide opinions on Professor Lee's presentation.
So you talked about the reunification process of Germany, and you compare that to Korea. You talked about the similarities and differences between the two, and you also talked about how Confederation cannot be a realistic option. You said that Phase 1 for reunification on the Korean Peninsula is reunion between the separated families, correspondence, as well as cultural exchanges and tourism exchanges. And I think that was quite valid. But then, in case of Germany, the two Germanys not only exchanged with each other, but they also had non-official exchanges which contributed to the reunification of Germany.
유엔과 미국의
Now,
제재가
the
계속
UN
되겠지만
and the US will continue on with their sanctions on North Korea, but exchanges with North Korea can happen with humanitarian assistance to the regime.
네 가지를 생각해
So
봤습니다.
I have 4 points that I would like to tell you. First,
종교단체 상호교류.
the exchanges between religious organizations. Number 2, the Gun county level agricultural exchanges. Number 3, to provide support planting of trees in North Korea. And number 4 is cultural and art exchange with North Korea. Well, from 1957 to 1990, West Germany provided 2.3 billion marks to East Germany, and they supplied goods to East Germany at the time during this period, which means that the cost of reunification was less than division, and I think that was the rationale behind such aid.
아까 자매결연 얘기를 했는데
Now we talked about sister exchanges,
도시 간의 자매결연을
and the East and West Germany also pursued sister city cooperation. And I would like to also propose that idea to Korea, because we have many counties and provinces in Korea and South Korea, the 2 Koreas. So we could pursue sister alliance between different counties,
군단이 자매결연을 주장한 이유는
especially at the rural areas, because North Korea's economic system relies on agriculture and fisheries, and grain production as well as fisheries production is key to North Korea's survival. For instance, Yuhan Kimberley for the past 15 years provided help to Mongolia. So it helped the desertification assistance program by planting many trees, about 15,000 trees. Next, about art and cultural exchanges, we can pursue that in Kaesong, and also we can have a joint excavation of remains. At the same time, we could pursue exchanges between and reunion between the separated families.
앞으로 우리는 국가하고 단의 교류도 중요하지만
So of course,
인간 차원의 교류와
exchange at the national level is important, but we should drill that down to the county level. And I would like to know what Professor Lee's opinion is about that question. Thank you very much for your presentations. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for your comments. So you used extra time, but anyways, I think it will take about an hour for the 2 presenters to answer that. So please be brief with your answers. Now moving on to President Kang Seok-seung. Yes, hello everyone. I think this is the last day of KGFP 2021, and I think that our session was arranged on day 3 because they wanted us to provide good ideas going forward. So since my time in the Ministry of Reunification, I have been studying this topic very much, and I visited other countries quite often to learn from other cases as well. And of course, we have many differences with that of Germany, but still we can learn much from what happened in Germany in developing our own model for Korea's reunification. So how can the East-West Germany's case teach us in building our own framework? I think that can be quite useful. Thank you very much for your presentations. So thank you for your presentations. Now, Professor Lee said that our prospect is gloomy for reunification. And I would like to ask you why? Why so gloomy? Because if it's so gloomy, then what's the point of discussing ways of reunification between between the two Koreas. And one of the slogans in North Korea is the road is bumpy, but still let's be on the positive side. But now, if it's too gloomy, not many people will want to embark on the journey. So let's really give hope and be optimistic about the future. But then you started your presentation by saying that the prospects were gloomy. So maybe that kind of dampened the mood. Now, you talked about Confederation. You said that it's temporary and we have no successful precedent. And while the armistice agreement is being ignored in Korea, then what's the point of declaring the end of the war? And well, I think that you heard this from someone, but it's about not accepting the reality of Korea. But then people from the outside call Koreans, especially Japanese, call Koreans 조센징 and say that we tend to be too impatient. But then I think that expression is degrading our people. So please do not use that terminology, because now this is being live streamed on YouTube and we have so many audience with us. So of course you are senior to me, but please do not be too pessimistic about the future, because we have so many eyes on us. So I would like to politely express my disagreement with you. And I have actually a written commentary, but when you have time, please read through my commentary. And I mostly agree with your approach, but as a discussant, I would like to ask a few questions. First, about the reunification of the two countries. You said that we need to take a phased approach in learning from Germany, but we need a more detailed approach about what we can do to learn from Germany's case. So, Professor Lee, thank you very much for the presentation, and you have an extensive experience in serving in many different organizations, and I'm sure that you can teach us much more about the tangible outcomes or tangible ideas that we can implement to realize reunification on the Korean Peninsula. And you talked about the policies of West Germany in helping East Germany. So in the front of diplomacy or politics and security and so on. But we have to be reminded of what President Gorbachev did back then. Glasnost and Perestroika. So that's one policy that we can learn from Gorbachev in terms of increasing openness and transparency. So now I would like to know what you make of this policy. And I was surprised of this, what you said, but about the cutting-edge society that we live in, everything is very much cutting edge.
I understand that Professor Hosaka is an expert in Tokyo Island issue, but you seem to be an expert about the German reunification. So I wonder how you became so professional in this area, if you have any opinions on this, on how we can further develop. And thank you very much for your comments. And you were in public service for a very long time, and you talked about the despair and the hopes during those times. And I think your comments were based on your such experience. And then we will go on to attorney Kyusik Che. As was introduced, I am from law firm Sanzi, and I am Kyusik Che, attorney at law. And for 20 years, I was a prosecutor, and then Last year, September, I retired as a prosecutor and became an attorney. And during the times, I made preparations for the legal structure for the unified Korea, and I felt that that was my mission in my life and that my calling, and that's why within the prosecutor's office I worked in those offices. In 2005 I had a training in Germany, Munich, and in 2015 I also worked as a attorney supporting the office at Germany, diplomatic office, and then I also worked 1 year for the human rights records in North Korea. So I think that I have made some efforts. And if we have reunification suddenly, I think we have made preparations in preparing for a unified Korea, and that was a major area of interest for me. And today, we are talking about more long-term perspectives of unification of first, second, and third phase. And if we are able to go through such phases like this, it will require North Korea's cooperation and support, and having such a long-term reunification, something that the academia and the policymakers and the government and people can prepare. However, what we mostly worry about is more sudden reunification. And Professor Hosaka Yuji, I hear many of his interviews on the radio, and it was a pleasure to meet him in person as a presenter, and it was an honor. And on Hosaka Yuji's presentation, I agree fully to your comments, and I want to ask a couple of questions, and it is about the basic treaty. I put that in for you to just refer to, and I will go immediately into my question. In your presentation, you talked about the fact that East and West Germany recognize each other as states. But as far as I know, West Germany were resistant in recognizing East Europe as a state, and East Europe continuously pursued South Korea to consider it as a state, and permanent office was established, and a permanent representative office was established, and this seems to demonstrate that West Germany was unwilling to recognize East Germany as a country, because if it was recognized as another country or a state, then they would have established the diplomatic office. And in the end of the 1990s, in Korea, we had the basic Inter-Korean Basic Agreement in 1991, and the Basic Treaty of Germany. What are the differences and similarities of these two treaties? And number 3, Ostpolitics, the diplomacy toward Eastern Europe that led to the road to unification, and Korea's sunshine policy and northern policy. It could not continue. It failed and it was discontinued. Do you have any ideas on what led to such failures? And fourth, Japan. It seems to be that they are opposing improved inter-Korean relations, and you said that it would be favorable if a more progressive administration can take office during the next general elections. But is there another way in which we can encourage cooperation from the Japanese side? And my fifth question is, so sudden unification, we need to make preparations for this, and what should then the Korean government prepare for in case of a sudden unification? And it was an honor for me to participate as a discussant in this important occasion, and I hope we have more lively discussions like this so we can have a prosperous, unified country, and I hope that our country can support and serve other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, panelists, for your discussion and for asking many questions.
대답하기는 쉽지
it will not be possible to entertain all the questions.
우리가 화두로 가지고
So let us use that as a theme, a framework to create a culture for reunification. I will give the presenters 5 minutes each to provide their answers. 5 minutes? Yes.
양해를 해주십시오. 큰 화두를 던졌다고
So please understand that we don't have enough time.
답변하도록 하겠습니다.
I will answer the questions. First, on the question raised by Jae-hyun Lee, President of the IEAPS. To give you some background of the Hanoi summit, John Bolton, the security advisor, and the Japanese government's relationship, from that point, you have to go back in history 14 years from that point. So, the Japanese government is very tight with John Bolton. You have to understand that. And at the time, Japan was arguing that Washington and Pyongyang, other than the ICBM, they were interested in the discarding of the short-range and mid-range missiles too. That is because if the inter-Korean relations and U.S. relations can normalize, DPRK and Japan, they don't have diplomatic relations. Therefore, Japan was worried that even if the ICBM is discarded, if DPRK maintains its mid and short-range missiles, it could be aiming at Japan, and that was their worry. Therefore, they wanted a Libya-type method, which was argued by John Bolton, and Japan was all for this. That's why the Japanese government and John Bolton had a very tight relation and in-depth relation. And one case that demonstrates this is that John Bolton, he wrote a memoir, and if you look at his memoir, he says that he is criticizing all of the heads of states, including Trump, but he praises Prime Minister Abe of Japan, and it shows how close and favorable the relationship between John Bolton and the Japanese administration was. And even today, Japan announced that the Prime Minister of Japan and also the national defense doesn't need to have any receipts for their budget, and probably such budgets would be used for supporting people like John Bolton, and that's my speculation. But in any case, the biggest reason why Washington and Pyongyang could not come to an agreement during the Hanoi summit was DPRK said that they would get rid of, dismantle all of Yeonbyeon facility, but the U.S. wanted to include another nuclear site, and that both of the sites needed to be dismantled or else they could not negotiate. And for DPRK, they had 5 economic sanctions, and they wanted to exchange lifting of the 5 sanctions with the dismantling of the Yeonbyeon facility. That was the argument of DPRK, but the U.S. was saying that's not enough, that they have to completely dismantle and destroy even another facility. And John Bolton was the one that said that you will be criticized in the United States if you accept the request of the DPRK, and that's what led to the fallout of the negotiation. And John Bolton was working on the same ship with Japan, saying that there could not be an agreement between US and DPRK if it wasn't the style of Libya. Therefore, the operations of Japan worked by making Trump agree to John Bolton's proposal. So that is my argument. And another matter on the Japanese abductee issue, Japan will continuously raise the Japanese abductee issue because Japanese, 17 of them have been abducted and only 5 have been returned to Japan. That is the argument of the Japan. And this is a justification that adds legitimacy to Japan. Therefore, they will try to argue for this continuously. And I think that South Korea should engage Japan in this abductee issue. You shouldn't think that it's irrelevant, so why are you talking about that? If that's your approach, they will not come to the table. During the six-party talks, Bush made a proposal to China, and the first one who made a comment was Japan. So Japan spoke to Washington, Washington spoke to China, and this led to the six-party talks. Therefore, you have to do some fact check of this. That's how it was broadcast in Japan, but we don't know what really went on, but that was what Japan said, and that so if you completely ignore Japan's request, then that might lead to even more difficulties. And there was another question on why I am interested in inter-Korean relations and German unification and how I became interested in this area. At the university class, since 1945, I am teaching the history of Korea and the history of DPRK. And when teaching the history of the two Koreas, it's imperative that I study German reunification. And so to teach my classes in university, inevitably I became interested in this area, and that's how I came to give this presentation today. And I am not someone just researching Dokdo. I research Korea-Japan relations and inter-Korean relations. And the attorney asked me various questions. And first of all, whether the two Germanys recognize one another as a country. West Germany was hesitant, reluctant. That is true. However, Willy Brandt wanted to recognize East Germany as a country, but within West Germany, there were conservative parties, and the Conservative Party was strongly opposed to this. Why should we recognize East Germany as a state, as a country, and as a nation? And so instead of specifying this, they can use the word states, because state can be interpreted as a nation or a state of a nation. So they utilize this more of an ambiguous terminology intentionally. But in reality, they did recognize Germany, East Germany as a nation, and they had this permanent representative office. And this was having an office in actual practice. And for the other questions, I know that there were many, but due to time constraint, because I have used much more than my 5 minutes, I think I will have to answer to those questions in a different occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Yuji. Yes, so you used up all your time. You used less time during your presentation, but now you used extra time. So please, Professor Lee, be on time. Yes, President Lee talked about not only focusing on the inter-Korean exchanges at the government level, but at the private level. Yes, I totally agree with you, and we have to seek that path. The religious organizations, yes, of course, they must exchange. And Donghak and Dokdo are the two themes that the two Koreas can converge. So, of course, yes, they must foster private level exchanges, but that's not the case, which is why the prospect is gloomy. If it is very dark outside, if the weather is not good, let's admit that the weather is not good. And that is the reality now. And Koreans do not want to admit the reality. It's in their personality. So they do not admit that others are doing better than them, and they fail to admit that they are losing to others. But let's not do that. If we haven't achieved much, let's admit that we haven't achieved much. And we have to have a very stark analysis of what happened and then pave the way forward. Do we have a way out? That was a question from President Kang also. Yes, I said that there were no successful precedents for Confederation, and that's just the reality. So we cannot blindly pursue Confederation when it will not work. So I raised a question about that. Then we need to find a new way forward. What else do we have? What other cards can we use? And if you were to ask me what options we have, then I cannot tell you here right now. It's up to the researchers to research more about what options we have. But of course, I have been advising many research centers, and I have been working for research centers. But many times, it's just formality. So what I mean by that, they make the decisions and they only engage people who will agree with them. But that's not the right way forward. We have to listen to the opinions of those who disagree and also seek the advice of the outside. So as someone who studied law, we need a legal approach. That's my message. Of course, we need to address the issue of inter-Korean relations in the context of international law. So, of course, we have to have dialogues and have talks and agree on the principle. So, in English, it's principle-based negotiations. So it looks like exchanges of ideas will do, but then that's not the case. We need to have witnesses, we have to have supporters, two-party, four-party, six-party talks should take place. We need to scale up the level of talks. If you are not an expert in law, then you may not fully understand my point, but I'm giving you my message from the perspective of a person who studied law. And you talked about the difference between the basic treaty in Korea and the one in Germany. And we have to say this. So the one in Korea is not a legal treaty. And the national assemblies in both Koreas did not ratify the treaty. So the one in Germany is the only one that follows norms and standards. Yes, thank you very much for that. It's now 12, and the initial plan was to receive some questions from the audience in person and also the virtual audience. So it's not just you here asking questions. You can use the QR code to ask questions, and the audience who have joined us on YouTube can also ask questions. but I do not know how to use this tablet PC, and it seems like we haven't received any questions from the virtual audience. So let's just say that we have had the Q&A session, and if you allow me, then I will just wrap up the session with a brief remark. I think that we focus more on the hardware when it comes to reunification, about the treaty and about the relations with the 4 major countries and so forth. But then, if you look at the case of Germany, they've experienced a long history of paving the path for reunification. That's the software. So it's about not the hardware but the software, and I think that we need to take serious efforts in building the software for reunification on the Korean Peninsula. All the members of Korea must be aligned about what path we need to take, what journey we need to embark to bring reunification on the Korean Peninsula. And this type of workshop is a milestone, is a stepping stone for building reunification on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much, presenters. Thank you very much, discussants, for your time. And thank you for joining us today despite your busy schedules. So with that, I would like to close session 8-1. Thank you very much. Yes, so I have a few comments to make. Thank you very much, presenters and discussants. This room only allows up to 20 people because of the virus. So each one of you represent about 100 people. And if we pursue that spirit, then I believe that we can achieve reunification on the Korean Peninsula very easily. And lunch will be served at Kisoya at B1. And I actually had lunch on day 1, and it was pretty nice. So please go to Kisoya for lunch. And Dr. Tong will be serving you lunch. It's on his institution. So enjoy lunch and